So, how do I look?
Kind of like a raggy, hairy bone.
Mike, you can come out now.
Oh, boy.
Mickey, come on. Peter, Are you all right?
Picture this. It's 1966. NBC hands a TV show to four guys who had never played a single note together before the cameras rolled, and somehow it turns into one of the strangest, most successful pop culture experiments of the decade. Micky Dolenz brought the manic energy. Davy Jones was the teen idol heartthrob. Michael Nesmith had the dry Texas wit, and that hat he never took off. And Peter Tork was the gentle oddball who held the whole thing together. The show only lasted 2 seasons and 58 episodes, but in that short window it produced a string of massive hit singles, a genuine chart record nobody has ever broken, and enough behind-the-scenes chaos to fill several books. What began as a manufactured answer to Beatlemania somehow grew into something real. Today we're counting down 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally embarrassing facts about the Monkees, the almost name that would have killed them before they started, the rock legend they rejected for having crooked teeth, the number they made up that the press repeated for 50 years, and the reboot disaster that nobody asked for. If you're into deep dives on classic television, stick around, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. Most bands start in a garage, a basement, or a bar. The Monkees started in a production office. In 1965, producers Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider pitched Screen Gems on an American answer to the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night, a scripted comedy about a struggling rock group. Their first move wasn't to build a band from nothing. According to Biography.com, Rafelson and Schneider initially wanted to sign an already working act, and the folk rock group The Lovin' Spoonful was high on their list. That plan collapsed because the Spoonful's songwriter John Sebastian had already locked the band into a recording contract elsewhere, which meant Screen Gems couldn't control or profit from the music the way the deal required. So the producers pivoted to building the group member by member, treating it more like casting a play than forming a band. On September 8, 1965, Daily Variety and The Hollywood Reporter ran an now famous casting notice looking for, as multiple entertainment histories confirm, for insane boys aged 17 to 21 who were willing to act as well as play music. Hundreds of young men answered that ad. Only a handful got callbacks, and only 4 ever got the job. It's a strange origin story for a band that would go on to outsell almost everyone else in America within 2 years, and that manufactured beginning followed them everywhere, giving critics an easy line of attack for decades. While the other 3 were discovered through open casting, Davy Jones was already locked in before the ad even ran. Screen Gems had signed him to a long-term contract back in September 1964, and he wasn't some unknown kid hoping for a break. Jones had starred as the Artful Dodger in the original Broadway production of Oliver, a performance strong enough to earn him a Tony Award nomination for Best Featured Actor in a Musical in 1963, according to entertainment reference sites tracking his early career. He'd even performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, the same night the Beatles made their American television debut in February 1964, which is a wild bit of historical timing on its own. So when Rafelson and Schneider needed a photogenic lead with real stage experience, they already had their guy. Everyone else had to fight for the job. Jones simply had to show up. Reports on the casting call vary slightly, with some sources citing 437 applicants and others rounding up toward 500, but the scale was enormous for a project nobody had heard of yet. Out of that flood of hopeful folk singers and rock musicians, Michael Nesmith stood out almost immediately, and according to accounts from entertainment historians, part of what caught the producer's attention was simple. He wore a wool hat to his audition and carried himself with an unbothered, almost bored confidence that read as instantly authentic on camera. Nesmith was also the only one of the eventual 4 who saw the actual print ad and walked in cold. Micky Dolenz, a former child star who'd led the 1950 series Circus Boy under the name Mickey Braddock, was already making rounds at Hollywood auditions when he heard about the project through the industry grapevine. Peter Tork, meanwhile, didn't even see the ad. He found out about the audition through a friend's tip, and that friend has quite a story of his own, which we'll get to shortly. Here's one of the strangest side stories in rock history, and it belongs entirely to Michael Nesmith. His mother, Bet Nesmith Graham, was a single mom working as a secretary in Dallas in the 1950s. Frustrated with cleaning up typing mistakes on the new electric typewriters, she mixed white tempera paint in her kitchen and began painting over her errors, eventually turning that homemade fix into a product she called liquid paper. Historical accounts, including her Texas State Historical Association biography, note that she was fired from her secretarial job in 1958 after her home-brewed correction fluid started showing up on official bank paperwork. Instead of giving up, she built liquid paper into an international company, and in 1979, she sold it to the Gillette Corporation for roughly $47.5 million. Michael, her only son, had spent time as a teenager helping bottle the product in the family garage. When Bet passed away in 1980, just months after the sale closed, Nesmith inherited a substantial portion of her estate, reportedly worth tens of millions of dollars. The twist is that by the time the inheritance landed, Nesmith's post-Monkees music career had stalled out financially, and by his own later accounts, he was dealing with serious money troubles. That money didn't just change his personal circumstances, it funded a genuinely interesting second act. He backed music projects, helped finance films including the cult classic Repo Man, and later became a key figure in the earliest days of music video television, which we'll return to later in this list. It's a strange full-circle story. A correction fluid invented to fix office typos in the 1950s ended up quietly bankrolling part of the media landscape that gave us MTV. In 1965, a 20-year-old singer-songwriter named Stephen Stills auditioned for the Monkees, and by nearly every account, he was musically the strongest person in the room. He had real folk credentials, sharp songwriting instincts, and serious guitar chops. But Rafelson and Schneider weren't just hiring musicians, they were casting a television show. And 1965 network television had extremely narrow ideas about what a teen idol was supposed to look like. Stills was reportedly passed over for two shallow reasons. His teeth weren't considered camera-ready, and his hairline was already beginning to recede. The producers apparently still liked him personally and asked if he knew anyone with a similar vibe who might photograph better. Stills recommended his friend and Greenwich Village roommate, Peter Tork. Tork auditioned and got the part. It's worth noting there may have been more to the rejection than looks alone. Screen Gems required cast members to sign away publishing rights to any original songs they contributed, and reports suggest Stills wasn't willing to give up that kind of control. Either way, the rejection turned out to be one of the more consequential near misses in music history. Stills went on to co-found Buffalo Springfield with a young Neil Young, and later formed Crosby, Stills and Nash, one of the defining acts of the era. In 1997, Stills became the first person ever inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice in the same night, once with Buffalo Springfield and once with Crosby, Stills and Nash, all because a TV producer in 1965 didn't like his smile. Stills wasn't the only future star who showed up to that casting call and walked away empty-handed. Singer-songwriter Harry Nilsson auditioned and didn't make the cut, but he impressed the producers enough that they later purchased his songs, and his composition, Cuddly Toy, ended up on the Monkees album Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited. Nilsson went on to write and record Everybody's Talkin' and Without You, building one of the most respected songwriting careers of the era. Paul Williams also tried out. He didn't get picked either, but he later wrote We've Only Just Begun, Rainy Days and Mondays, and The Rainbow Connection, becoming one of the most successful songwriters of the 1970s. And then there's the rumor that refuses to die, the claim that Charles Manson auditioned for the Monkees. It's a persistent piece of internet folklore, but it isn't true. Manson was incarcerated during the actual 1965 casting period, making his attendance physically impossible. Interestingly, Micky Dolenz himself has been credited with accidentally starting the rumor decades later with an offhand joke, which then spread across the internet as if it were documented fact. It's a good reminder that even well-documented pop culture history picks up urban legends over time, and the Monkees, given how much scrutiny their authenticity always attracted, seem to have collected more than their fair share. Before settling on the Monkees, the producers reportedly floated some genuinely rough alternatives. One early contender was The Creeps, which is not exactly the kind of name a network wants printed on a lunchbox aimed at teenagers. Another suggestion was The Inevitables, which sounds less like a pop group and more like a policy debate team. Eventually, the team landed on the Monkees, spelled with two E's as a deliberate misspelling, following a British invasion trend of playful, slightly off-kilter band names. The same instinct that gave the world the Beatles, with an A instead of an E. The tweaked spelling gave the show a built-in visual gag and an instantly recognizable guitar-shaped logo that ended up plastered across merchandise for decades. It's a small decision, but a different name might have completely changed how seriously, or unseriously, audiences took the whole project from the start. Here's something the fan club newsletters weren't advertising in 1966. The actual band members had very little to do with the music on their first two albums. Those records were built largely by professional songwriters and an elite group of Los Angeles session musicians, sometimes referred to collectively as the Wrecking Crew, the same players who worked on hit records for the Beach Boys, Frank Sinatra, and a huge share of what was on the radio in that era. The Monkees themselves largely handled lead vocals and left the instrumental tracks to the professionals. Music supervisor Don Kirshner ran the operation efficiently, and the record sold in enormous numbers, but the arrangement infuriated the band, especially Nesmith and Tork, both accomplished musicians in their own right who wanted creative input. Tension boiled over in January 1967 when Kirshner released the album, More of the Monkees, without properly consulting the group, reportedly using a cover photo pulled from a promotional shoot and liner notes that barely mentioned the band at all. According to multiple biographical accounts, the band members had to buy their own copies from a record store because nobody had bothered to give them one. Michael Nesmith had reached his limit. During a heated confrontation with Kirshner at the Beverly Hills Hotel, Nesmith reportedly punched a hole through a wall and told Kirshner it could have been his face. Nesmith later confirmed the incident happened in his memoir, Infinite Tuesday, describing it as a moment where he lost his temper because he felt his artistic integrity was being dismissed. Kirshner didn't back down immediately, and when he went ahead and released a single in Canada without the band's approval, the studio had seen enough. Kirshner was fired, and the Monkees finally won full creative control over their own recordings. What they did with that control was Headquarters, an album the band largely wrote, arranged, and played themselves, produced by Chip Douglas. It reached #1 on the Billboard 200, but only held that spot for a single week before being knocked off by an album that happened to come out around the same time, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. So the one time the Monkees proved beyond doubt that they were a real band, one of the most acclaimed albums in rock history landed right on top of them and spent the rest of the summer keeping Headquarters pinned at #2. Despite the chaos behind the scenes, 1967 was an absurdly dominant year commercially. The Monkees landed 4 separate albums at #1 on the Billboard 200 within a single calendar year. The Monkees, More of the Monkees, Headquarters, and Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited. No act before or since, including the Beatles, Elvis Presley, or any other major artist, has matched 4 #1 albums in 1 year. Their singles kept pace too, with Last Train to Clarksville, I'm a Believer, and Daydream Believer, all reaching #1 on the Hot 100. I'm a Believer, written by Neil Diamond, held the top spot for 7 weeks and remains one of the best-selling singles of the entire decade. For decades, you've probably heard some version of this claim. In 1967, the Monkees outsold the Beatles and the Rolling Stones combined. It's been repeated in major newspapers, magazine retrospectives, and countless online articles. There's just one problem. According to multiple entertainment researchers who have traced the claim back to its source, the specific figure, that the group sold 35 million records in 1967, more than the Beatles and Stones combined, originated with Nesmith himself in a 1977 interview. And it wasn't true. Nesmith later acknowledged it was invented, essentially an offhand exaggeration that a reporter wrote down as fact, and that the media then repeated for roughly 50 years without ever checking it. The frustrating part is that the real story didn't need embellishing. The Monkees genuinely outsold the Beatles in U.S. album sales during both 1966 and 1967. driven by a weekly television show that functioned as a built-in advertisement for every new record. They really were the best-selling act in America for a stretch. But the specific outsold the Beatles and the Stones' combined figure is pure fabrication that somehow became accepted music history. By the second season, the studio had a logistical problem, for increasingly independent-minded young stars kept wandering off the set between takes, occasionally trailing the smell of something the network definitely didn't want associated with a family sitcom. So, according to Micky Dolenz's own recollection as reported in entertainment retrospectives, the studio built what the band nicknamed the Black Box, a soundproof, windowless, air-conditioned room tucked behind the soundstage, sealed off by a single door with a heavy-duty freezer-style handle. Inside were a few pillows, some candles, and a wall-mounted light for each Monkee. When your light lit up, you were needed on set immediately. The official explanation was efficiency, keeping the cast close and available. The unofficial explanation was control, keeping 4 unpredictable young musicians out of view of studio executives and visiting press. But there's a genuinely interesting irony buried in the story. Trapped together in that windowless room with nothing to do but wait for a light bulb, the band actually bonded, jammed, and developed a musical chemistry that would later fuel their push to play their own instruments. A room built to contain them accidentally became their unofficial rehearsal space. In 1968, the Monkees released a feature film called Head, and it was almost the exact opposite of everything their TV show represented. Gone were the tidy sitcom plots and beach house gags. In their place, surreal, nonlinear imagery, Vietnam-era commentary, and a script that openly mocked the band's manufactured origins. The whole project reportedly began with director Bob Rafelson, the band, and a then largely unknown actor named Jack Nicholson spending time together brainstorming ideas into a tape recorder, which Nicholson later organized into a screenplay he co-wrote with Rafelson. The marketing made things worse. Multiple film historians note that the original poster didn't feature the band at all, just an anonymous close-up image, meaning even loyal fans scanning theater listings had no way of knowing the movie existed. Confirmed box office records show Head earned back roughly $16,000 against a $750,000 budget, one of the more dramatic financial flops of the era relative to its size. Critic Roger Ebert's contemporary review captured the disconnect well. Fans who did show up felt alienated by it, and the audience it might have appealed to never showed up in the first place because they'd already written the band off as a joke. What makes the story even stranger is Nicholson's very next project after co-writing this commercial disaster was Easy Rider, one of the defining films of the following year. Head has since been reevaluated, earning a Criterion Collection release and a reputation as one of the most fascinating oddities of late 1960s cinema. But at the time it was a strange creative gamble that almost nobody noticed. The original pilot for the Monkees reportedly scored among the lowest test audience ratings NBC had recorded up to that point. It was shot on a tight budget in late 1965, with the cast wearing much of their own clothing because there wasn't money for a proper wardrobe department. But the bigger issue wasn't the budget, it was the format. The fast-cut, slightly chaotic comedic style confused test viewers who had no context for who these 4 guys were supposed to be or why they should care about them. So producer Bob Rafelson made a smart, relatively simple fix. He re-edited the pilot to open with candid, documentary-style screen test footage of the 4 actual cast members, letting audiences meet the real people before diving into the scripted chaos. That small structural change transformed the results. The revised cut scored among the highest pilot test ratings NBC had ever recorded, and the network responded by ordering 2 full seasons on the spot, an unusually aggressive commitment for a show that had tested disastrously only weeks earlier. Sometimes the difference between a flop and a hit really is just how you frame the same footage. The Monkees ending in 1968 gets remembered as a cancellation, but the real story is messier than that. By the second season, the band had won creative control over their music, but the television show itself was still stuck in the same slapstick format from season 1, and the group had grown visibly tired of it. When talks turned to a possible 3rd season, the Monkees reportedly pushed NBC towards something closer to a variety show format. NBC wanted them to stick with the original sitcom structure or walk. They chose to walk. Sponsors had also begun pulling back during the second season, and by that point the band's attention was largely consumed by the ahead film project. So calling it a mutual parting is probably more accurate than calling it a cancellation. The story doesn't end there, though. On February 23, 1986, MTV aired a marathon of the original series to mark its 20th anniversary, and it accidentally reignited the entire phenomenon. A new generation who hadn't even been alive in the 1960s fell for the show. Monkees albums re-entered the Billboard charts simultaneously, and Micky Dolenz, Davy Jones, and Peter Tork reunited for a reunion tour that became one of the top-grossing live acts of that year. Hollywood, naturally, tried to bottle that lightning a second time. In September 1987, a reboot called New Monkees premiered, produced by Columbia Pictures Television with a soundtrack released through Warner Brothers Records. Out of a reported 3,000 applicants, producers selected 4 new performers: Larry Saltis, Marty Ross, Dino Kovas, and Jared Chandler, this time chosen primarily for musical ability rather than acting chops, and placed inside a neon-drenched mansion, complete with a talking computer named Helen and a robotic butler. The concept clearly borrowed the original manufactured band formula down to the audition process, but nothing else about the execution translated. The television side and the record label side reportedly never coordinated promotion effectively, so neither the show nor the album gave the other any real momentum, and the original Monkees filed a lawsuit over use of the name, which was eventually settled out of court, but generated exactly the kind of bad press a struggling show didn't need. Of 22 planned episodes, only 13 ever aired before the whole thing was quietly pulled from syndication. In the span of about a year, the Monkees' name went from one of the biggest nostalgic comebacks in MTV history to a reboot so unwanted it barely lasted a single season. A strange bookend to a story that began with a casting call in a trade newspaper more than 2 decades earlier. And that's the strange, contradictory legacy of a band that was manufactured for television and somehow became one of the most genuinely influential acts of the decade anyway, right down to helping lay the groundwork for the modern music video format that eventually built an entire television network around itself. Which of these 15 facts caught you most off guard? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into 1960s television history, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.